Welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today we're talking to RAND policy analyst Paul Cormarie, who co-authored a policy recommendation article with his colleague Joe Haberman 2 weeks ago. This article was published on justsecurity.org and also on RAND's website. It's titled, "The U.S. Can't Guarantee Armenia's Security Despite Azerbaijan's Threats, but it can help." Paul Cormarie, thanks for accepting our invitation. Welcome to the show.
Welcome, Paul.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And nice to meet you both, Asbed and Hovik.
Thanks for coming. Before we get started, we'd like to remind you to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and consider buying us a coffee or two or three, or better yet, become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. For those who have already supported us, we really appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing to bring you interesting content such as today's discussion.
Thank you for your support.
Indeed. Paul, as this is your first time on our show, would you tell our listeners a little something about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Paul Cormarie. I am a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. I've been analyzing foreign policy issues and the transatlantic security partnership for the past 2 to 3 years. I've done my master's degree at Georgetown University in foreign affairs, and I'm interested in topics such as force planning, military personnel, security cooperation, as well as European defense. And I look forward to talking with you guys. I've had a few experiences at NATO Parliamentary Assembly, as well as the EU delegation to the United States. And kind of those two experiences, as diplomatic and military as they are, can be a useful way to kind of see how I can bring in my analysis. So thank you so much for having me. Sorry.
Great to meet you online here. Yeah. So, Paul, in your article, you ask, should the United States even care about what happens in the South Caucasus? And your first look response is that, no, there's no strategic value to the U.S. Then you dig a little deeper and you posit that an invasion of Armenia by Azerbaijan would run counter to American interests. Can you explain why? What are America's strategic interests and objectives in the South Caucasus?
Well, it ties itself with some of the feedback we actually got from this article, which it's a line I kind of see illustrates well the problem. Someone told me if Armenia tomorrow ceases to exist, nothing will happen in America. No one will suddenly start to say like, oh, like that's a huge issue. Realistically speaking, it won't dramatically change anything in the political spectrum in the United States. Unlike Ukraine or other regions in the world where it is actually, those regions are seen much more critically as being critical objectives to the United States and its national security. With that being said, we do say in the article very much clearly is that, well, if there is conflict, if there is a sort of a hot war that erupts between Azerbaijan and Armenia into the region, that is going to have some important impact in the broader region, and also that will necessarily have the impact U.S. strategic, interests in the region. Unlike Russia, unlike Europe, unlike Iran and other partners and competitors to the United States, the United States doesn't really have a huge role into the region traditionally, historically, and whatsoever. But there is a potential conflict could have impact on all of the aforementioned people, so competitors to the United States. It could have an impact on Iran and Russia. It could also have an impact on the U.S. partners and allies, and the EU for the energy supply. So as a consequence, it's hard not to see how a conflict could not necessarily impact the U.S. position to some extent. So that's why when we frame the overall foreign policy approach of the United States in the region, we always framed it within those interests. The U.S. has some interests, but those interests are very limited and are more geared towards the specific outcome it seeks to prevent.
Right.
And as a result, we should try to gear the foreign policy approach so that we don't reach that outcome, but a sort of outcome that is beneficial to its partners, and to some extent puts into check its competitors as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Armenia has 4 neighbors: Iran, Georgia, Turkey, Azerbaijan. As
Yeah.
long as Iran and the West are in conflict, the Western support cannot reach Armenia through it. Azerbaijan and Turkey are the actual threats that we are trying to mitigate here, so no Western support will reach Armenia through them. And Georgia is deeply reliant on Turkey and Azerbaijan in many aspects, so Armenians do not believe that it can be a reliable conduit for external support in a time of need, like when you said a war breaks out or something like that. So if the US truly wants to support Armenia, supply weapons to Armenia that really matter, and that could potentially be used against Azerbaijan and even Turkey, how would it do something like this with the geographic limitations?
Yeah, I mean that's an important problem, but there are 2 aspects that need to be considered. The first one is that Georgia, although it's reliant to some degree to Turkey and Azerbaijan, it is also increasingly reliant to the EU, because it is now a candidate to try to join the EU, and it's trying to have a deepening of its relationship with Brussels. As a consequence, Georgia has some sort of an engagement with some of the European partners, and that's something that we can necessarily leverage with our partners at some point in terms of basically being able to continue to be able to have access to Armenia. And the second aspect that I wanted to get into was that we have a good example of how feasible it is. France already provided some weapons and some arms and equipment. They've done so through Georgia, and it has not revealed to be somewhat of a hard hill to climb for France in order to deliver those systems. So it seems that the constraints, geographically speaking, are not as important as they are thought to be. However, that was within a context of Nagorno-Karabakh. So it is that was not a hot war. So we need to see into the limitations in terms of if there is a hot war, will Georgia put back into question its delivery of equipment? I'm not I'm not a regional specialist. I'm much more of a defense specialist, so I cannot tell you more into detail what's the strategic thinking behind Georgia. But I do expect that there are going to be increasing limitations,
Right.
But as well, we do have some leverage.
Understood. Because even in time of, I won't call it peace, but it's not a hot war right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Tbilisi, I think, did stand up a little bit of the deliveries of the APCs from France until basically Paris called Tbilisi, and whatever arrangements were made, and those things went through. So there are concerns that in the time of war there could be higher barriers to getting anything through. We all understand that. Now, Paul, you note that the United States should provide Armenia with the capabilities to defend itself while setting clear expectations about the limits of its commitment. What are those limits, and what should be these clear expectations? Can you detail these things out a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of go more into detail into the piece, but basically the rough idea is that Armenia is short on its most precious commodity right now, which is time. Armenia is out of time in terms of the amount of time we can procure, we can deliver equipment, reform the armed forces, being able to actually provide some of the necessary tools that Armenia needs in order to enforce its territorial sovereignty. And that's within a context in which Baku is increasingly saying that we need to do Western Azerbaijan and whatever. So the threat is only mounting when the time is decreasing, and as a result, that is I think the biggest limitation. The other limitations that we have is that there are some of the systems that we can't really deliver to Armenia, given of how sensitive technologically speaking they are. There has been some concerns from France in the delivery of its systems because of Armenia's continued membership to CSTO, although it's been frozen. And so there has been some of those limitations. So it looks like those limitations are decreasing, and there is more and more of a relation of a trust between the West and Yerevan. But it is going to have to take into account the fact that within this context of limitations, there is still some help that could be made. And that's some of the paths that we outline in the article that don't necessarily take into account those limitations. Those limitations exist, and they act as a roof to the ambition that we should take.
So, Paul, for instance, I don't know how much in detail we should go, but you do suggest in the article that, for instance, the U.S. Should supply Armenia with MANPADs as well as trophy countermeasure systems. And you further added that arms exports to Armenia could also include broader counter-drone systems currently in development. What were the principles that went into these recommendations? For instance, why MANPADs specifically? Is that something that you believe Armenia is lacking at this moment? And just a little bit of a reasoning why those specific recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's my niche contribution to this article, actually, between me and Joe. Joe is much more of a political analyst, and I'm much more of a defense analyst. So that was kind of my niche expertise I could bring. So when I was talking about MANPADs, I was talking about the specifically Stingers and Javelins from the United States Defense Industrial Base. Those systems have been super useful when we look into conflicts like Ukraine and elsewhere, and preventing some sort of a air superiority, but also a sort of a mechanized armored superiority on the other side. And the great advantage of those systems is that those systems are defensive. Like you can't send in javelins and say like, oh, we're doing this because we want Armenia to invade
the country.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so there's both a really good aspect of defense, and at the same time, they're really useful in deterring an opponent's willingness to invade the country, because they know that because of those systems like Stingers and Javelins, they will lose a lot of equipment by trying to invade afterwards. The only problem, and that comes in the limitations that I've already described earlier. The problem is foreign military sales, they take time. It's not a done deal like with France, where it's the president has a sole authority to decide whether or not it's able to export arms, and basically the monopoly of foreign policy in the Elysee in France. In the United States, there needs to be an authorization by Congress. And only those that are expedited are those that reach a certain threshold in terms of their costs. So as a result, given that it would be only to that degree of procurement of javelins and Stingers, it won't reach that threshold so that it's expedited. So it's going to take some time. And you add the other component and the other limitation, which is, well, javelins and Stingers right now, we'd rather send them to Ukraine, or we'd rather send them to Taiwan.
That was going to be my question. Yes.
Yeah. So that's another limitation that we have. But you need to take into account it's to the United States' interest to kind of steam up that procurement, to kind of get those things rolling to whomever, because yes, our defense industrial base is currently stretched thin through multiple clients, multiple regions in the world, but you need to take into account that the DIB, the defense industrial base, can expand, and that's what we're trying to do. So actually, by sending javelins and Stingers and having more customers for those types of systems, that would only be beneficial to the United States. It would keep our defense industrial base being warm and to have to be able to hire more people, invest in more infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So as a result, I was kind of going in with that mentality when I wrote that segment in that article. However, we need to take into account another thing that's important, is that, well, It's in the foreign military sales kind of lingua, but we say international solutions to refer to other procurers than the United States in terms of systems. And I mentioned the French missiles and in the French defense equipment that's also being sent from Thales, the French company, in terms of defense equipment. But there are also in MANPADs, there's the Mistral, there's also like other types of MANPADs that could be useful as an international provider. And that's why we talk so much about, diversifying that set of relations for Armenia. It's not to Armenia's interest to be only on the United States in terms of procurement. There's actually a really, really good piece that came out on this outlet I found out through digging the research for this piece in the past months, has been the EVN report. They made this piece that basically, outlaid the procurement landscape for Armenia. And it basically brings home this point that we have in this article. It's to Armenia's advantage if it has a diverse set of partners and not just the United States, so that it can procure systems from all of those countries like India, France, all of those countries that are able to have a select source of suppliers so they can fill and modernize the Armenian armed forces. Azerbaijan has been doing that for the past 20 years. Armenia is still reliant on Soviet-style equipment that needs modernization, but also and goes beyond equipment. And we refer to that in the article as well. We talk about how much the entire armed forces structure and the way it works is so reliant on the Soviet system that it doesn't take into account some like important reforms that have been made in the armed forces, like the NCO, the non-commissioned officers that have been taken into account, say, and a good example of this is Ukraine. In Ukraine, they've reformed their armed forces since 2014. They've, thanks to sort of some NATO engagement that they had into the region, and they've kind of reformed their armed forces as a result, with non-commissioned officers for their military personnel, but also other stuff. And it made that when Russia invaded in 2022, that invasion was swiftly managed by the armed forces because they were very highly adaptable to the scenario that they were facing with. And that proved to be vital to the country in the early stage of the war. So now when we look into Armenia, if Azerbaijan decides to escalate to a hot war, and Armenia needs to be more adaptable, more flexible to any sort of response by Azerbaijan, it needs to rethink the ways in which it structured its military, and that's going to take a lot of reform.
Right. Actually, my pet peeve is, of course, we love diversification. It's a good thing, but in Armenia, it seems like lately diversification is a code word for a U-turn. I don't believe there will be any good from Armenia's procurement of weapons from the West at the expense of stopping procurement from Russia, because as you say, there is at least it'll take a time before this restructuring of the armed forces takes place.
So, Paul, as you mentioned military reforms, just a quick question, and I know you said that you're not a regional specialist on the South Caucasus, but we have heard from the Pashinyan government for 5 years, military reform. Do you have a general assessment about the current status of the Armenian Defense Forces? Because we are not really aware, and I'm wondering if you are aware of any kind of an upgrade of those forces.
I'm not aware of an upgrade, but I do want to mention the fact that the problem is, and that's what we're trying to articulate into the article, and that's why we try to call for a diplomatic response as well as trying to help militarily speaking. There needs to be a diplomatic one, because when you look into the net assessment between both countries, even if there's reform, even if there's the state-of-the-art equipment systems in the hands of Armenia that's able to repel an Azerbaijan offensive, Azerbaijan still has more forces, more equipment than Armenia does. And that's going to stay that way for multiple reasons for the very close foreseeable future. I think right now Azerbaijan has between 65 to 75,000 military personnel, while Armenia only has 40 to 45,000. So there's already this huge imbalance in terms of forces and military personnel, and then we look into the equipment that's much more modern and kind of like they're trained with that equipment as well, Azerbaijan. So even if Armenia procures those state-of-the-art systems and that equipment, it's also going to take some time for that personnel to get used to that style of equipment and getting time to kind of like get used to them. And so as a result, you have that just reinforces the need for reform into the armed forces. I don't know how much to what extent that reform, as you mentioned, has been deep into the military, but what I suspect needs to happen is that there needs to be better training. There needs to be a more professionalized armed force. There's still a conscription, but it needs to be more professionalized and to being able to support that type of state-of-the-art equipment, that modern equipment that they need. And also, third, it needs to be able to it needs to be adaptable and flexible.
Is this training a matter of weeks, months, years?
Months and years. It's not something that's it's I'll give you an example. I mean, it's a kind of a drastic example, but it's an example that's kind of fits my my view here. When Ukraine was when the West was deliberating whether or not it should send F-16s to Ukraine, the big argument then was we can't send F-16s because the Ukrainian pilots are not trained to handle Western equipment. So then the argument was, well, we need to start training them, and then eventually we'll figure out if we send or not some F-16s. That process of just training Ukrainian pilots, who are already some professionals with a large degree of experience in being able to already handle some Soviet equipment, it took them 6 to 12 months to being able to pilot. I believe it even took fairly a whole year, so that the current pilots that are trained to handle F-16s today began their training a year ago. So with that being said, that's for the air capabilities. That's a very different thing from handling just a Stinger and you just like put it in your shoulder and boom. But it's nonetheless some equipment will take more time than other types of equipment, and that also needs to take into account patterns of recruitment and retention when it comes to training of those personnel as well. It's one thing to do a conscripted force that's just being told put that Stinger on your shoulder and boom. It's another thing to be able to recruit and basically mobilize a force that's instructed and knows how to handle those issues. So that those things are, it's not just surface level reform, it's deep level reform. It goes deep into the way Armenia manages its personnel.
Okay, great, thank you. And I want to take us back a little bit to the specific recommendations in terms of types of arms. So on the topic of the French radars and air defense systems, from what I'm reading, it seems like the number of batteries of each of those kinds of systems is very small. And to me, this seems like, it would take then just they might be vulnerable just during the first strike. So, in terms of quantity, how serious is this procurement? And is this a type of weaponry that Armenia needs to sort of double down on and increase its investment in, or actually then maybe just invest in javelins and other easy fire and forget type of weapons that are cheaper relatively than the expensive air defense systems?
Well, I think to go back on the issue of time, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but Armenia needs time, and I think that the best bet that Armenia has currently is those systems, because I don't see any other country that would be able to, one, provide those systems at such a quick pace than the French did, given the close relationship between Paris and Yerevan, and also the sort of and also just the fact that the French system of exports of arms and weapons is so flexible and so adaptable that it's able to deliver systems so quickly. The United States cannot do that. And so if Armenia wants some systems that are like javelins and stingers instead of French MANPADs, that's going to take more time. Yes, it'll be more effective. It's kind of like in the French armed force, it's always described as a bonsai style of the American army, meaning that it can do a lot of things but smaller. And so that's the kind of the idea behind those French MANPADs. It's the same thing as the American ones, but smaller and less capable and less resilient than the American ones. However, there's still the type of equipment that Armenia needs. It's like, going to the dollar store and buying the smaller product you need because you need it now instead of waiting for the next day when it's open elsewhere. It's the same example here for this type of system.
The other thing that I wanted to bring up is that one of the natural vulnerabilities of Armenia is that its communication with the external world over land is limited, as we have already discussed. For instance, the main internet cable that Armenia uses goes through Georgian territory and is owned by actually an Azerbaijani entity. In the case of war in Ukraine, we have seen the West supply Ukraine with communications equipment, even commercial ones such as Starlink, and repurposed for military uses. Do you believe that this could be also something that the U.S. helps in, and maybe it's something that also can be done during this time crunch that we have? For instance, I don't know how, I'm not an expert in military communications, but also I'm interested in the command and control structure of the Armenian units. Could the U.S. easily retrofit a more resilient communication system on top of that?
So there's good news and bad news about that. The good news is that as you said yourself, C2, command and control, and domain awareness has proven to be the most important type of equipment in modern warfare. You've seen this in Ukraine, where and that goes into the adaptability point that I had mentioned earlier. It's important for those smaller units when in a position of defense. They need to have domain awareness so that they can actually be able to predict how many units are coming their way, being able to kind of know what terrain they're dealing with, and also being basically able to sustain their armed force from equipment jamming from the other side. And so that means that it needs to be state-of-the-art C2. The problem is, the bad news is that Azerbaijan has been modernizing their armed force for the past 20 years with very modern equipment from Turkey, Israel, and elsewhere. So they have a ton of stuff that's able to jam those Armenian radars and the C2 equipment that Armenia has that, by the way, is mostly, I don't know into detail what type of C2 equipment Armenia has, but I suspect it must be some Soviet-era radar communication equipment. So as a result, I don't believe that it's going to be very sustainable to the more modern systems that Azerbaijan has. So there's this discrepancy in modernity in C2 communications between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So what can the United States do? Well, as you've noted, Starlink has provided some sort of a crucial kind of a step for Ukraine to be able to improve their C2 throughout the conflict. But the problem with that is that we've seen in recent years that even Russian forces have been using Starlink as well. So we have this situation in which, it has been a useful advantage to the more Western-friendly country, but eventually the other side also gets its hands on it. So, and in my honest opinion, the first kind of use of Starlink in Ukraine was more motivated kind of a public communications from Starlink than an actual strategic consideration from the owner of Starlink. And you can clearly see that with the change in rhetoric and the whatever that has been happening for the past few months, where Russia started using it. So yeah, we've made our promotional use of Starlink now that everyone knows about it. No need to keep giving the monopoly to Ukraine. So in my honest opinion, I wouldn't be surprised if both Azerbaijan and Armenia would use Starlink actually in the context of a hot war. That being said, France has been providing some more modern radars, and that's been essential to kind of modernization that type of equipment to Armenia. As a result, it wouldn't be too surprising. It would be very important for the United States to, when it does any type of foreign military sales with Armenia, if Armenia chooses to provide not only javelins, stingers, also just for reference, because I don't think I've clarified that javelins are for tanks, stingers, planes, drones. If we have those types of radars with those types of equipments, we're kind of having a sort of a all defense approach, meaning that we're having capabilities to both sustain visible equipment, like, you know, aerial and ground equipment, but also like invisible types of offensives, like, you know, jamming, hacking, and all of those that come with a modern conflict. So yeah, those are my points about that, but it will necessarily have to go through the same ways, meaning, you know, Georgia, right? So that's a consideration that we've already explained.
Understood. Thank you.
Hovik, let's just take a moment here. We'd like to remind our listeners to go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, or just go to podcasts.groong.org, and there's a donate link there. And consider buying us a coffee, or better yet, become a sustaining member of Groong through our Patreon link and give us monthly.
You know, there aren't that many shows like us who digest Armenian news weekly and bring you interesting discussions relevant to it in English language and in a regular manner. We have always operated as a labor of love, and we're not only nonprofit, but we're also non-budget, unfortunately. So we rely on listeners like you to help us. Just 2 to 3 friends who have committed our life's time and effort to understand the world around Armenians and Armenia, and sharing that understanding with you.
So we will continue to do our work as we always have, but your support will help us expand our reach to more people who are interested in Armenian affairs around the world.
So please visit our donate page. Again, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and consider supporting us. Thank you in advance. We appreciate your listening to us, and we take that trust and your support very seriously.
Thank you. So let me shift a little bit from the military field to diplomacy. In your article, you say that the U.S. could help neutralize the threat coming from Turkey by helping normalize Turkey-Armenia relations and acting as a mediator in that process. As we know, Turkey has put forth preconditions that Turkish-Armenian normalization hinges on fulfilling Azerbaijani demands. And at the same time, we know that Turkey itself has historic problems related to Armenia supporting international efforts towards the recognition of the Armenian genocide. So this goes a long way. It goes a century back. And we're not even mentioning the fact that most analysts that we talk to actually believe that the so-called Zangezur Corridor project is mainly backed and promoted by Turkey. Do you think it's realistic to expect that the U.S. could foster a more positive stance by Turkey towards Armenia presently, when Armenia is at its weakest, given these historic positions and preconditions by Turkey?
Well, that was a Joe's niche contribution.
I remember you said that you had the military field and he had the diplomatic.
But I do want to say that we wrote that angle while we were taking into account, like, this was not an article that we wrote in a single week. This took a lot of time, and this is something that we started actually even in we began working on it back in October 2023 actually. And it's something that, with all of the events that happened since then, you know, it's been hard to kind of like change sort of the dynamics in our paper. But we began that diplomatic analysis without the context of Turkey letting Sweden into the alliance. And so that was an important context that has since then developed. And there was then a lot of complications with both the Sweden's accession to NATO, but also the F-16 program in Turkey. So the United States had somewhat of a leverage back then. That diplomatic leverage has changed. So as a result, I sort of expect that the diplomatic context is much different from what we had originally intended through this piece. However, Turkey is still an important partner to the United States, and it still seeks to kind of like fit those F-16s with missiles and being able to supply its equipment with Western equipment. And as a result, Turkey is still very much an engaged partner of the United States. It's not something that, like the situation on the ground in the South Caucasus is not something that we would be bringing up out of nowhere in a meeting.
Right.
We have ongoing discussions with Turkey. And so as a result, like it's something that we, behind the scenes, I kind of expect an ongoing diplomatic engagement on those issues.
Yeah.
I think that when it comes to the corridor and Turkey's relations to Azerbaijan, however, the United States has been sort of pushing a bit more Baku since last year with some of the sanctions that it imposed on religious, I forgot specifically, but it was on civil society more than it was on financial and military aspects. So the United States can still impose sanctions tomorrow if it chose to on Azerbaijan. And those sanctions, unlike the sanctions for Russia, those sanctions would be much more impactful for Azerbaijan. And so the stick here is, the carrot is kind of normalizing ties with Turkey and finding a diplomatic approach so that it satisfies all parties. The stick, however, is a big stick. It's kind of like a way in which the United States can punish the sort of economic and energy provisions that Azerbaijan exports that are critical to its own economy. So it's unlike Russia is a large country that can sort of develop a sort of a domestic market to kind of keep on its economy going. Azerbaijan can do the same thing.
But when you say that this is a big stick, is it like an on-off switch? Is it a all-in or basically levels of sanctions that could be applied? Because I've actually been very surprised that over the course of the past few years, with so much belligerence on the part of Azerbaijan, there hasn't been some form of, let's say, arm twisting during negotiations, saying, "Come on, people, let's move these things forward."
Yeah.
At least from our perspective, I don't know if I'm being completely subjective here. It seems to me that Pashinyan goes to these negotiations in Brussels and Washington, etc., and caves from my perspective and comes back with nothing.
Yeah. And right before the essentially the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, 5 days before that, Yuri Kim, Deputy Director at State Department, said, I'm quoting her, "We will not tolerate military escalation by Azerbaijan or military, I believe, will not tolerate the military conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh," or something to that effect. Yet 5 days later, we learned that they would tolerate it, and even they said, no more business as usual with Baku, meaning that they're not going to send any high-level ranking diplomats, except that the next week they sent a high-ranking diplomat to Baku. So I believe that many Armenians have a little bit of a cynicism when it comes to believing these Western promises. So what can be done to, well, your article goes, I think is a positive in that direction, but what could be done to convince these policymakers in the State Department that, they should move more aggressively in terms of sanctions against Azerbaijan?
Well, for starters, Congress is actually getting more active on this issue. And that's something that we refer in the article is kind of like the way in which Congress has been kind of like slamming the table on we need to protect Armenia. We need to be able to give Armenia what it needs and all of that. And so as a consequence, Congress has historically played the role of a pressure on the State Department to be able to actually engage on certain topics that it was kind of reticent to engage in. You mentioned the fact that, the State Department has not really acted, and it's been, how can I play this? It was kind of dishonest. It could be perceived as dishonest in terms of its approach. But as you said, it's not an on-off switch. It can be basically perceived as like a gradual step. It's like you've got military escalation and you've got diplomatic escalation, right?
Yeah. So I do believe that with Azerbaijan, the stick can work. So far, they've tried more carrots than sticks. I want to take us back to Turkey, because it was interesting when you said the NATO and Sweden relationship. That was actually one of my questions, where I felt like Turkey, of course, is a much bigger country. So sanctions against it are going to be either a lot more tempered or maybe not as effective. But how could the U.S. deter Turkey from a role in the conflagration? Because Armenians are concerned that if there is a next conflagration, it's going to be inside Armenia, and Turkey, we've heard, could become a direct actor rather than just working through proxies this time. And since we're thinking of what could the United States do, we were thinking, is it possible that any kind of weapons acquisitions by Turkey could come with rules preventing the use of such weaponry to go against Armenia? And where NATO Sweden comes in is that Canada had similar rules that they're not going to provide all these Bayraktar parts to Turkey. But during the NATO Sweden negotiations, those rules were dropped because, as the ambassador told us last week, Turkey is a valuable ally, and it is a member of NATO, so there are obligations all around. So we are concerned that in the middle of a war, Turkey could temporarily choose to ignore those rules, create new realities on the ground, and then apologize for them. And what can the U.S. do?
Yeah. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Right.
Exactly. That's my deep concern here.
Yeah. No, it's a valid concern. I don't think the United States has there's got to be some like behind the scenes, and that's always something that's an ongoing engagement with Turkey, and it's one that makes it very much it's a hard engagement, because you would see the ways in which Turkey has often maximalist, objectives in foreign policy that makes it hard to collaborate it with, to the point where, and that's something I forgot to mention earlier, but it wouldn't be the first time that Turkey goes into a proxy war with another NATO member, France, elsewhere outside of NATO, right? They did the same thing in Libya. So like it would be basically the same thing all over again. But apart from that, I do want to have the kind of the expectation that Turkey is going to always act when it's going to be reaching its own interests, and that I don't think its interest here is to see an Armenia that's gone, because it needs Armenia in the sense of like it needs that leverage for domestic reasons, so that Erdogan can like kind of move around the flag of like, oh well, we've got those enemies in the east, and
whip up some nationalism.
Exactly, and also some like further destabilize the eastern part of Turkey that's already rocked by perceived terrorists of the Kurds and all of that. So for Turkey, it has somewhat of an interest in keeping Armenia around, so to speak.
Which is weird to me, because any rational Turk who believes that a country that is 25 times smaller in size is a major threat to them.
Yeah, no, but I mean,
poll after poll indicates that they think Armenia is a major threat.
Yeah, no, but it's I don't want to go into the whole civilian discourse in the region, but I do feel like Turkey has some interest in which they are compatible with U.S. interests in the region, which is maintaining stability, and I'm just suggesting that in case we do want to actually start to act up in terms of like, help to Armenia instead of just standing back, we kind of need to meet Turkey in that same level playing field. Because to be honest, if Turkey wanted Armenia gone, Armenia would be already gone. I mean,
right.
It's something that's kind of
it's a few hours of work.
I mean, yeah, it's when you look at the capabilities of Turkey and its sort of leverage, and it has used Armenia as a source of leverage. And it's now just an awkward situation now that, oh, well, they have sort of the guarantee that Russia wouldn't step in if they actually start to bully Armenia or whatever. Well, it's an awkward situation. It's kind of figuring out, oh, well, it's like the two dogs on a leash that are barking to each other. Then suddenly the closure like opens and they're like awkwardly staring at each other and they're just not barking to each other anymore. Just to use that analogy, the situation has changed a lot outside of those two countries, and so the diplomatic engagement needs to be more complex. I just don't know how to reach that end.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul, in fact, you mentioned that if Turkey wanted Armenia gone, it would be gone, and you rightly stated that one of the reasons why it is not gone, and I firmly believe that is Russian guarantees of Armenian security in the past. I mean, things have changed, and there's a little bit of debate of the chicken and the egg, whether it is Armenia that sort of is making things worse by alienating Russia nowadays and making it easier for Russia to stand back. But I want to talk about the third dog on the leash here, which is Iran. And, Iran has a great interest in ensuring Armenia exists. In the conflict period, the pre-war period, it was acting more softly. It wasn't advertising its moves, but for all those 30 years, Armenia and Armenian forces and Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh ensured a great amount of stability on the northern border with Iran. So after the 2020 war, Iran articulated its red lines, indicating that it will not tolerate any geopolitical changes in the region, and it has emphasized the integrity of its border with Armenia. And in fact, we do believe that out of all regional powers that have some capability, at least we believe that Iran is the most incentivized in sustaining Armenia's territorial integrity today. But we also hear some analysis that Armenia has refused advances from Iran in terms of supplies of drones and other weaponry, as well as military exercises, joint military exercises, because of concerns about Western sanctions. So my question is simple. Could Armenia be a forum of cooperation between the West and Iran, similar to Syria, if the existence of Armenia is such an important goal for all sides?
Yeah, I mean, the fourth dog on the leash here is Israel, right? Unfortunately, there's that added component in which any possibility of compartmentalization on the subject of Armenia between Iran and the West boils down to the current conflict in the Middle East, and that unfortunately has consequence with like our own ability to compartmentalize Armenia. I mean, I think was it this week or last week when Iran's foreign minister was in Yerevan and said that we won't accept any Western turn for Armenia, and so as a result, there are using also maximalist, you'd think that it would be okay if it were just Turkey doing maximalist approaches in terms of its foreign policy, but it seems that everyone does it in this region. And you have Iran that's doing the same thing again, where it has a maximalist kind of position so far when it comes to the Middle East, and also for Armenia by warning not to U-turn on its foreign policy, and so I think that's why I cannot predict the future. I can't predict that suddenly we will be able to collaborate with Iran because it takes some regional specialization and knowledge that I don't have. However, I do want to say that two things is that the first thing is that Iran seems to be the only country that doesn't the only neighbor of Armenia that doesn't hate Armenia. And that means a great deal given Armenia's
well, Georgia as well, but like the
Georgia is
only power.
ambivalent.
Yeah, exactly. So there's Georgia as well, but like you see what I mean. Like as in terms of a bigger neighbor, Armenia needs to take what it has at the moment. And with the current set of cards that it has in its hands, it needs to deal with it. So there's that angle. But the second thing I wanted to say, it kind of reinforces the overall argument that we've tried to carry throughout this paper, which is we need a diverse set of partners. There's not going to be a single way in which, when Pashinyan said that we need to diversify relations, he needs to mean it. He needs to not put all of his eggs into the Western basket or into the Iranian basket or into the Russian basket. It needs to be able to choose which egg it wants in every basket. And so I suspect that Iran is going to have a few demands in terms of Armenia's foreign policy orientation, but at the end of the day, it's Yerevan that decides which country to engage with on which specific issue. Like if it decides to do, foreign procurement of systems and weapons, it can procure. So it's where it gets complicated because unfortunately there are some standards that apply to some types of equipment. That means that if you buy a certain Western equipment, you can't, backfill it with some Indian equipment and whatnot. And that goes with ammunition, that goes with the type of fitting that you put on, like in armored vehicles, say, if you want to have a specific standard for your own armed forces. Otherwise, you end up like the Indonesian Air Force that has 7 types of different planes in their Air Force. And so that's why you really need to have, and for many reasons, you need to have a sort of a standard type of armed force. However, it doesn't mean that you're not able to pick and choose in terms of equipment. And you're also able to pick and choose in type of diplomatic engagement. Armenia began diversifying its relations with a great partner, India. It ties itself with another proxy kind of engagement with Pakistan as well. But, at least it's someone else than just the West. It's someone else than just like its neighbors. The other day when I was on Voice of America, I said that Armenia should consider Mongolia's foreign policy the third neighbor strategy, meaning that, slammed between 2 giants that just want you dead. Well, you got to find a way to have a third neighbor that's going to be able to participate. But that third neighbor is not a single entity, but many types of partners. And that's what, Armenia should be interested in seeking in terms of its foreign policy approach. Yeah, that's about my thinking on the topic, but it's of course it's with the American mindset of someone who's not actually the biggest specialist on the region, but at least has some ideas.
All right, we'll leave it there for today. What an interesting conversation we've had today. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. We hope you can be on our show again.
Absolutely, I would love to.
Thank you.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on March 26, 2024. Please remember to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and consider buying us a coffee, or better yet, become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. Thank you in advance. We've been talking with Paul Cormarie, who is a policy analyst at RAND's Washington, D.C. office. His research focuses on NATO and European defense policy, force planning, and security cooperation. Check out his fuller bio on our show notes. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And I'm Hovik Manucharyan.
Please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.